Dark Souls 2 feels like a game where there was no cut content. It's like they had thousands of ideas and was like, let's add every single one. Which this does help explain the reception for this game. There's going to be lots of people that adore all the interesting features, and there are others that don't and maybe wish it was a little bit more streamlined. But a game for everyone is a game for no one, and we all have different preferences, and caring about whether or not someone actually likes or dislikes this game should not matter to you. But with that being said, we are going to go over the 3 best and worst things about Dark Souls 2, and don't worry, I'm going to keep the same energy that I did with Dark Souls 1 and the Elden Ring video. Now, the best thing about Dark Souls 2, in my opinion, is the build creation. There are so many things that Dark Souls 2 implemented that help enhance the builds, the major one being the infusion system. Long gone are the days of having to farm for all these stupid amounts of materials just to be able to change the weapon's affinity. In this game, there's only 3 types of materials, which they do have some discrepancy issues. Petrified Bones and Twinkling Titanite could be a bit more abundant, and also does not gate kept behind DLCs, but it's still infinitely more manageable than what we had in the previous games, and you can basically infuse every weapon in the game too, even boss weapons, meaning that almost every weapon is going to be made viable. And on top of that, the infusions are pretty good. Every elemental infusion was amazing because you could use spell buffs alongside with them, which might make them the meta, but the standard path is still very viable because almost everything is weaker to physical damage in this game. Poison infusions are also great because that's probably the best status effect. Unfortunately, cannot speak highly of the bleed infusion though. But then you have raw infusions, which are great for early game or weapons with bad scalings, and the mundane infusion, which is probably the most interesting of the bunch, as it can scale with any stat technically, but it's only really going to be useful at higher levels or with weapons that get bad base damage. Another amazing thing that the build creation did was add a new spell type in Hexes and a damage type in Dark, which the spell types are all equally as good in my opinion and really fun to use. And the stat distribution was done so well. You had Lightning for Faith, Magic for Intelligence, and then you had Fire and Dark for Faith or Intelligence. But both of those damage types worked a bit differently, which I'm glad they actually switched Pyromancy builds to actually scale up a stat and not just have it tied to just getting lots of souls. Like, Pyromancers are really powerful in Dark Souls 1, but there was like no build creation behind it. But in this game, the build creation was done almost flawlessly. The only thing that it might not do the best in is that Elden Ring lets you change your infusions at any point for free. But Elden Ring doesn't get as good as build creation without Dark Souls 2, and a lot of the cool and interesting weapons, spells, and mechanics don't happen either. Which is going to be my second positive point on the game. All the cool and unique shit that they added. The ability to power sense weapons of the same type, and sometimes even different weapon types, which is something that Elden Ring kinda lacked. Like if the Clean Rod Spear and Thrusting Sword were in Dark Souls 2, it would have had a unique power sensing combo, like what the Knights had. Dark Souls 2 had lots of different interesting ideas when it did come to movesets. Now, unlike Elden Ring, 90% of the power sensing combos are just not optimal due to the stat requirements and stamina cost, but they're still fun. Now, there are so many more cool things that I just want to rapid fire off. You can get weapons that can punch, stomp, shoot projectiles, weapons that can turn into lightsabers when you swing it, weapons that have weapons inside of the weapon. I can build 2 giant drumsticks. I can build around bare fist punching and actually have it be viable. I can dress up as a butterfly to poison enemies around me and jump really far. Like, there's so much interesting stuff, and it really felt like the developers enjoyed making this game. And all this build creation helps out with the replay value, which is going to be my next positive point. Souls games tend to just have lots of replayability due to their combat. They typically lack cool PvE game modes like Boss Rush or Horde modes, but things like PvP, New Game Plus, and trying out new builds tend to do it for you, and none probably do it better than Dark Souls 2. You have a different New Game Plus with added enemies and different items. You have bonfire aesthetics, which is kind of a way to virtually get to New Game Plus, as it does inherently revive the bosses and respawn items, which it can make for a complete unbalanced mess sometimes. Probably the reason why they didn't add it into the later games, because you do have to balance the game around them. And Lord knows what bonfire aesthetics would have done to Elden Ring. Like, that game is broken enough as it is. But having more freedoms in your playthrough is not a bad thing. Also to note that PvP is done very well, especially with the Covenants and Arena that they added. It probably has the best PvP combats too, but probably not the best PvP overall due to the stupid soul memory mechanic. Okay, now for the worst things about Dark Souls 2. Look, there's many things that can be said, but I think I can summarize a lot of them in one point. You can call it a skill issue or whatever. I've done my fair share of playthroughs and challenge runs, but the bearer of the curse, the protagonist, fucking sucks. This bozo right here is just a nerfed version of every other protagonist, and it pisses me off. He can't even roll 3 times or swing a weapon 3 times without running out of stamina, can't even redirect basic light attacks, which is something you could even do in Dark Souls 1. Randomized jumping, like why is the distance of your jump tied to RNG? Buddy Pal drinks an Estus flask like it's a nice warm cup of tea. Dying decreases your max HP for some stupid reason. His legs get shattered on a 3-foot fall. Takes forever to enter a fog wall. Also the only guy to not get iframes too. Getting hit in the head by a random arrow just puts you in a temporary coma. Can't even quit out the game while falling down, nor does it actually despawn enemies. He also gets stunlocked by the most basic of enemies and the smallest of weapons. Like, all of this is just artificial difficulty, which honestly isn't the worst thing sometimes, because we can get given the tools to counter him. But in this instance, it's not the enemies getting the artificial boost, and it's us getting stuck playing with this dumbass. Like, people complain about the ganks of Dark Souls 2 and that there are way too many enemies, but the thing is, games like Dark Souls 3 literally have more ganks. But the difference being is that Dark Souls 3 gives you the tools to counter said ganks. Way less stamina cost on weapons and rolls, the weapons can redirect very easily. Also, every trash mob just gets no poise. So with all these things combined, you just have the option to play it safe or be aggressive. There's more freedoms in playstyle, whereas Dark Souls 2, it very much caters towards and encourages passive playstyle and taking your time, which is fine if you like that, but for a big chunk of players out there, it fucking sucks. And combined with the long boss runbacks, the health draining mechanic, and all the other stuff I mentioned, your playthrough can downward spiral so quickly, and more so than any other game. Like, soon as you die once or twice, you'll just get frustrated and just keep running in there and keep dying, and the next thing you know, half your health is gone, and your entire playthrough is ruined. Which is why every single time I get asked the question, what are some tips for Dark Souls 2? I just say, take your time, don't be afraid to look things up, and just use weapons that don't really consume much stamina. Which is kind of going to lead me into my next point, the stats. The stats are awfully designed in Dark Souls 2. As I mentioned, I do like the damage type distribution between the stats. I also love attunement boosting your casting speed and strength giving you a ×2 boost, but that's about it. The whole formula of the stats is that you don't really benefit as much, but you get lots of souls to level up, which honestly doesn't feel as satisfying. Like, your damaging stats don't even give you as much of a boost as some rings would. Endurance only gives you 1 point in stamina per level, which is stupid, especially with how expensive everything is. And then you have your filler stats. Adaptability and vitality. Holy shit, what were they thinking? Why do we have a stat that's tied to your iframes in your healing speed and adaptability, and why isn't it explained to the player? All this does is make your character feel like shit to play until you level up to make it feel a bit more respectable. The process of leveling up should make you go from meh to really cool, not shit to meh. But the funny thing is, as bad as adaptability is, I think vitality is even worse, which this stat boosts your equipment load. But in the other games, this was also tied to endurance. That's why when you had larger weapons, you weren't entirely penalized by having to level up an additional stat, because you're also getting some stamina too. And you actually got more stamina per level in Dark Souls 1. But now you have to level up another stat on top of endurance, which is stupid because, as I mentioned, a lot of the weapons just have large stamina cost. And it's also just another adaptability issue all over again, because ideally you want to be below 50% equipment load to maximize your iframes, so you have to spec into the stat just to be able to roll better, just like adaptability. And you got to level up that one too. So any single time that you're using large weapons or you're power stancing, you're just automatically nerfed for a big portion of the game because you have to level up almost every single stat. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that if you spec into roughly 15 vitality, you miss out on benefiting from one of the best rings in the entire game, in the Flynn's ring. So this game very much just caters towards lighter weapons, and the two-handed strength bonus is just not enough to compensate, especially because not every single heavy weapon is strength-based, and there are some strength weapons that are light too. Now, as for my last negative point, I kind of wanted to cover annoying enemies or shitty animations. Then I realized a part of the reason why I don't like fighting a lot of the enemies is because they have shitty animations. So now we get to talk about both. For our character, yeah, the sprinting and the rolling looks kind of jank and stupid. Sometimes though it can work out in our favor, like the fast follow-up light attacks after a running attack, or the quick power sensing follow-up after a normal light. The animations here look a bit off, but it makes us more powerful, so I'll allow it. Cool feature. But when it doesn't benefit me, terrible game design. Stupid ass enemies and their goofy running animations, insanely fast attacks that feel like they have no startup frames and always manage to stun lock you, projectile attacks that don't even aim at you but still track towards you, and then there's all the stupid grabbing animations too. Every single one just looks like shit. And yeah, sometimes they have shitty hitboxes, but for the most time, it's just some stupid ass delay, and it makes me disgusted every time it happens. But while we are on the topic of hitboxes, some just don't make any sense. Like, why does the mimic chest do this? It had to be a prank. Also, why do some attacks just hit you twice sometimes? Why do some enemies get hitboxes on their legs when they're just walking? Why does the Fume Knight backhand get a hitbox too? And why does it do just as much damage as the weapon? Like, all this shit combined with the stupid animations and the jank controls just make it feel very dated. And it makes me wonder what the game would have been like if they just had a little bit more time and probably released it for the newer consoles and not the PS3 and Xbox 360. It probably would have looked something like their original gameplay reveal. Okay, that is that now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next video, I kind of want to make some more Elden Ring builds before I go talk about Dark Souls 3. And then after that, we'll probably touch on things like Demon Souls and Bloodborne. So definitely do subscribe for that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.